additional panelists here, who I will introduce in a second, for coming up on such last-minute notice. So we'll get right to it, introduce our panelists, and then pass it off to them. Here we have the Honorable Roy Altman, who is a judge on the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Florida. Next to him we have Ilya Shapiro, who is the Director of Constitutional Studies and a Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute. To his side we have Nadine Strossen, a former ACLU President and a current professor at New York Law School. And then on the end there we have the Honorable Lisa Branch, who serves as a judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll pass it off to the panelists.
All right. Thank you all for being here, and thanks for having us. We'll get right to it. Ilya, I guess there's no other way to put it. There was a brouhaha associated with this event.
I thought it was a foofara.
Whatever. And so maybe you could just start by describing how it is that we all got here. I'm not sure I know all the ins and outs of it.
Yeah. Over the summer, the Federal Society chapter, Tom Crean here, invited me to come, and we put our schedules together, and October 7th was the date. It wasn't because we're here commemorating the second anniversary of the darkest day in Jewish history since the Holocaust. It just happened to be the day on the calendar. I wasn't supposed to be speaking about Israel or even anti-Semitism as such. I was still on my book tour for Lawless, The Miseducation of America's Elites. 43% off on Amazon last I checked.
And it's a great book, really.
Thank you, Nadine. But then about less than a month ago, I started hearing that the students were running into trouble either booking the room or keeping the room. It's like that Seinfeld episode, right? You know, keep the reservation, book the reservation, right? They were told eventually that because of security concerns, my event couldn't be held. The reasoning from NYU Law kept shifting. It was, we're just not allowing external speakers that week, which was a lie. There's external speakers, even for FedSoc tomorrow. He's in the audience. Ted Frank, go to his event tomorrow. We just don't have enough staff. I mean, all of this disingenuousness or bureaucratic incompetence, I don't know what, but the long and the short of it was a heckler's veto, what's known as a heckler's veto. Because of the threat of pro-Hamas protests, because of course the Islamists in cahoots with the socialists, the red-green coalition, no wonder their symbol's a watermelon, have decided to mark this dark day as a celebration of atrocities and of killing Jews and all the rest of it. And so because of the threat of those kinds of protests, we couldn't have an event. Classic heckler's veto. A university as big and rich and self-claimed to be elite as NYU should be able to deal with that and enforce its rules against disruption, as we just heard the dean discuss. But it wasn't to be, and so FedSoc National stepped in. I'm grateful to Sheldon Gilbert and his team for so quickly coordinating an alternative event not far from here, at which point the media got wind of this and NYU magically found space for us. And so I'm grateful for that, and I'm grateful to be here with you, Roy, with Lisa, with Nadine, and with all of you in the audience. And now we have a national live stream. So this discussion, kind of a meta discussion of my book, which indicts higher education for an illiberal takeover that has led to all sorts of pathologies, indoctrination, cancel culture, etc. This incident has illustrated the main thesis of my book.
How much off on Amazon did you say it was?
43%.
43. Judge Branch?
Let me turn to Nadine. So what prompted you to join this panel?
I always accept any invitation to address free speech. That's in all seriousness. I stopped being a full-time faculty member at the end of 2019 because I found that the tide of illiberalism from both ends of the political spectrum was becoming so severe that I felt the most important way I could use my remaining time on this planet was to become a full-time evangelist for free speech. In addition, Ilya and I have been longtime colleagues and friends. I truly do think that his book is wonderful, but I would have done this even if it were somebody I didn't know even if it was somebody whose ideas I more strongly disagreed with. And Ilya and I have some disagreements, but they're not profound because of what is at stake. And that is the right of not only willing speakers to address audiences, but the right of audience members to choose to hear speakers and ideas. And the heckler's veto, whereby those who are opposed to particular ideas deprive both speakers and listeners of their First Amendment rights, is such a serious problem. I welcome the opportunity to constructively remedy it. And I do want to give, as a full-time activist, I have to be an optimist, so I always see the glass half full. Wow, more than half full. And I really do want to thank and salute NYU and the dean speaking for NYU. I think to acknowledge that one has made an error and to correct it takes, sometimes that's even harder to do than to do the right thing in the first place. And I was happy to see a statement from an organization I support, PEN America, which is at the intersection of free speech and literature. It is one of the sadly few liberally oriented organizations that has staunchly been in favor of free speech against the tide of leftist, progressive, woke illiberalism. PEN did a report about that problem way back in 2016, and is continuing to oppose illiberalism from either end of the ideological spectrum. So it issued a press release yesterday in which it first constructively criticized NYU for initially canceling the event, but went on to say that this situation illustrates that I'm quoting, universities can work to accommodate free speech when they try. NYU law has done the right thing here. And just one other point. So I'm wearing purple as a tribute to NYU. But also, I want to say the Federalist Society itself, in all seriousness, I speak for your organization more than I speak for any other organization. Given my age, I've probably spoken more than either any of our other distinguished panelists here, because from the beginning, the Federalist Society has been devoted to discussion. And as you well know, Tom, when you organize an event, a requirement is that you get a commentator, at least one other speaker with a different perspective. And when FedSoc came along, there was no alternative organization that was discussing constitutional law and civil liberties issues. And you continue to certainly give platforms to very diverse speakers and ideas. And you exemplify, in that sense, what campuses should strive for.
Well, we appreciate you, Nadine, and I appreciate you. If I can say one more thing on this beat about NYU before we go off to these more important, broader issues is, I don't think NYU's leadership, the dean or anyone else, was being anti-Semitic or even discriminating against me for not being progressive. I've spoken here before. It's gone without a hitch. But there are ideological blind spots baked into these structures and systems. This is a useful insight from critical theory, actually. There are structural issues that blind administrators, especially administrators. There's faculty bias, that's kind of a separate issue. But in my book, Lawless, 43% off, you can look at the bureaucracy and the culture of the bureaucracy that is biased in implicit sort of ways that they don't even realize. And so all of these misunderstandings, miscommunications, errors, what have you, even if acknowledged and rectified, all seem to go in the same direction from university administrations. But if we can pivot, I want to ask our moderators. We planned this, actually. This is not a gotcha. Because I'm so grateful for Lisa and Roy to be here to lend gravitas and their unique perspective. But I want to ask them, what caused you to come here? I mean, I appear with Nadine. I mean, as recently as 2 weeks ago, we did a free speech panel. But you're federal judges. You're busy. You have trials. You have arguments. Why are you here?
Lisa, you want to go first?
Sure. I guess there are a couple of reasons, several reasons actually, why I'm here. First of all, it's the Federalist Society chapter. I've never spoken at NYU before, but I'm certainly pleased to do so. I have been a member of the Atlanta Lawyers chapter board for gosh, I've lost track of how many years, but I've been a member of the Federalist Society for over 20 years, and that speaks, sadly, to my age as well. And also, when Judge Altman asks me what I'm doing on October 7th, my response will always be, where do you need me to be? And so it was just a question of where do I need to fly to? He's a dear friend, and when he asks a question like that, I'm going to come if my schedule in any way permits it. But there are really two reasons why I'm here, both because of the importance of campus speech and because it's the 2-year anniversary of the atrocities of October 7th. As for campus speech, I've been visiting law school campuses for over 3 years, warning students about the necessity of the free exchange of ideas, even ideas you hate. My campus visits were necessary because of the rise of the heckler's veto, as Ilya has talked about. All of a sudden, students started shouting down speakers and not permitting them to proceed with their remarks. It certainly happened to Ilya. It's happened, Judge Altman had protesters. And I would add myself to that, although it happened in a foreign country, so I'm not going to say this has anything to do with American students. And while I certainly appreciate that NYU did find a campus location for this event, I'm certainly disappointed in the events that originally unfolded, as Ilya discussed. But the other reason I'm here is because it is the anniversary of October 7th. And thinking back on that day, when images of the brutal terrorist attack orchestrated by Hamas on innocent civilians started circulating, I thought, how can I be witnessing the slaughter of Jews in my lifetime? We promised it would never happen again. I was reminded yet again never to underestimate man's capacity for evil. As I watched in horror and we learned that Hamas terrorists had butchered babies, raped women, chased and gunned down those attending a music festival, burned families alive, and shot elderly people at point-blank range in front of their families. I wept often, overwhelmed by the savagery. But then my resolve strengthened. What could I, as a Christian, do? I decided on 3 things. I realized it was no longer enough simply to say I stood beside my Jewish friends. It was time to stand in front of them, to let them know if anyone comes for them, they'll have to get past me first. When I watched my Jewish friends hold tight to each other, I realized they thought Jews were standing alone. I assure them they are not. Second, I went to Israel. Again, Judge Altman called, and so I followed. We went right after the pager incident, and so tensions were high. And we had 2 missile attacks that occurred. I was assured there would be no missile attacks on central Israel. That it was not true, and I had to reassure my family as we were sheltering in place that I would be okay. But it was still important for me to go, even though that was a tricky time. It was important for me to visit a kibbutz, one of the kibbutzes that had been attacked. It was important to visit the memorial set up at the music festival site. It was important for me to stand there, seeing exactly how close Gaza is, to see the fence, to be able to touch the fence that was cut as part of the attacks. It was important for me to meet with a hostage family. It was important for me to meet with government leaders. Through the trip, I showed my support, but it also helped me to understand the resilience and resolve of Jews. And 3, I reached out to my Jewish friends. I apologized for not understanding the true depth of anti-Semitism that they face in this country. And I checked in on them, both after October 7th and as incidents were unfolding around campuses, to see how they were dealing with October 7th and the aftermath. Hint, they weren't doing very well. And I pledged to check in often. I highly recommend you do the same. And so for these reasons, I needed to be here today on this campus on this anniversary.
Thank you so much. As a Jew and the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, and the wife of a member of the Israeli Defense Forces who's fought in 2 wars. I'm extremely moved and grateful for your remarks and your support. Our topic is anti-Semitism and free speech.
Let's hear from Roy.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
No, it's no problem. I don't think there's much that I can say after that. I just want to tell you, Lisa, I've told you many times before how deeply grateful I am for your love and your support. Judge Branch and I were in Israel meeting with the wife of a hostage who was being held in Hamas's tunnels deep underground for hundreds of days without adequate food or water or medicine, without being visited by the Red Cross. And we were both at the moment that she told us how hard it was when she was locked in her safe room and the Hamas terrorists were trying to burn down the home with her 2 daughters inside, believing that they would come out of it all right. And they did come out of it all right, but they came to find that their husband, who had gone out to try to distract the terrorists, had been captured and taken hostage. And at the moment that she began to tell us that her daughters had recently grown old enough to understand that they had a father and that he was missing, and that he was missing because he was being held captive by evil men, how she would begin to describe for those 2 little girls what the world really is for Jewish boys and girls. And at that moment, Lisa reached out and held my hand, and we held our hands together, and it's a moment I will never forget. So I appreciate you and all the many other federal judges, including Judge Committee, who's here, and Judge Singal, whose son is here, who have come and will be going to Israel on the judicial missions that we have planned. We've taken about 10% of the active federal judiciary on trips to Israel in just the last 2 years. I've opened it up to all the federal judges who want to go, and I have received so much demand that I've had to tell federal judges they can't go on this trip, and the last one, and the one after that. And you may know that federal judges don't like being told they can't do things. So what we have done is we've promised to keep them on a list and to take them in groups of about 20. This year we're taking 25 every single, 2 times a year, once in March and once in September, until every federal judge in the country who has had a chance to go can go. So people ask, well, why do you do that? You're a federal judge. You're supposed to be this monastic being who sits in his chambers with his law clerks and pumps out opinions in the cases or controversies that come before him. And that's just not our role. It has never been only our role. I see our role, and I think many of these judges see our roles as being much broader than that. We are here to uphold the rule of law. We are here to stand up for the benchmarks of our democracy, the hallmarks of Western civilization. What are they? Pluralism, tolerance of the other, free speech, diversity of viewpoint. Where are these things being practiced in the world today? Sadly, fewer and fewer places. Look around the Middle East. We want another Palestinian state. There's already one. It's called Jordan. And you can look up the history of that. We don't have time for it now. You want a second Palestinian state. That's great. What's it going to look like? Is it going to look like all the other Arab and Muslim states in the world that are either failed theocracies, failed jihadist havens, or absolute monarchies? There is only one country in this region that respects the benchmarks of our civilization: free speech, diversity of viewpoints, tolerance of the other, pluralism in an open and fair democracy, just as we do. There is only one country that was built in our image and in our name, and that is the State of Israel, where, by the way, 2.1 million Arab Muslims pray 5 times a day if they want, in places like Nazareth and Abu Ghosh and Rahat, all over the country, as free and equal citizens of a modern pluralistic democracy. We have a law professor here who clerked on the Israeli Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, in some respects, if you've studied comparative constitutional law, much more powerful, relatively speaking, than our Supreme Court. And she clerked for a Muslim justice on that Supreme Court. Imagine, a Jew wasn't even, before October 7th, even permitted by law to enter Gaza. We talk about apartheid. Only 2 Israelis had entered Gaza voluntarily since 2005 when the Israeli army withdrew, between 2005 and 2023. They both entered in 2014 and 2015. One was a Mr. Hisham al-Sayed, a Muslim Israeli who was mentally ill and who wandered by accident into Gaza. The second in 2015 was Avira Mengistu. He is a black Ethiopian Jew. Wait, no, what do you mean? Israelis are white supremacists, you say. 200,000 of them, folks, are black Israelis, Ethiopians that the Israeli government spent hundreds of millions of dollars and risked the lives of their soldiers to go rescue from desperate poverty and civil war in Sudan and Ethiopia, to bring them to Israel, to make them free and equal citizens in the modern state of Israel. So these two men, both mentally troubled, wander into Gaza. They're promptly kidnapped by Hamas for the crime of merely existing in Gaza. We talk about apartheid. That is the very definition of apartheid. And then what does Israel do? It releases 60 people who had murdered Jews serving life sentences in Israel in exchange for the lives of these two hostages that they got back from Hamas. One a black Jew, one a Muslim Israeli. That is the heart and soul of a pluralistic and free and modern society. And so why am I doing this? Why is Lisa coming? Why are all these judges coming? Because we have an obligation to stand up for what this country has always believed in, for what it has always represented, which is that Western civilization is a good thing, that America is a positive and the greatest force for good the world has ever known, and don't ever let them make you forget it.
I'm going to applaud that. That's why it's such great irony and tragedy that the heart of anti-Semitism in America that flared up after October 7th seems to be among the most educated and so-called progressive people on our campuses. And that's where you see, you know, another example of how historically wherever anti-Semitism has flared up, it's a canary in a coal mine, the tip of the iceberg that shows that there are many pathologies underneath, including in these contexts on campus in higher ed, a going away from classical liberal values like free speech and academic freedom and due process and equality under the law. It's a tragedy, and it's a sickness in these institutions. It goes more broadly. I mean, we're here to talk about free speech and how it relates to anti-Semitism, but it's more broad than that. And there are failures of ideology, bureaucracy, and leadership to explain it.
Well, as I was starting to say, and I'm so happy that you reminded me, we hadn't heard from Roy why he's here, because that was incredibly eloquent. Our topic is anti-Semitism and free speech on campus, and all three of my distinguished co-panelists have well illustrated why the most important, effective, as well as principled response to anti-Semitism or any other form of hatred or discrimination is robust free speech. I wrote a book. I gave copies to the two federal judges, so I don't have it to display, but the title is Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship. And it's always been cheap, even without a discount. You know, I could not be more committed to combating anti-Semitism. And as a result of the research that I did for that book, I am more convinced than ever that not only is censorship unprincipled, inconsistent with the great democratic principles that Roy referred to, but that it also is at best ineffective and at worst counterproductive as a strategy for dealing with the problem, which is an attitude, right? We want to change how people think. We want to change how they behave. And we don't do that, with all due respect to those who administer the criminal law. It is not an effective way to change those attitudes. This is an issue that has gone throughout American law and throughout the history of the ACLU. If I say the word Skokie, how many of you have an association with what that means? Younger people, not as much anymore, which is too bad, and why a classic book about the Skokie case, which I will summarize in a second momentarily, has just been republished. It's called Defending My Enemy, American Nazis, Skokie, and the Legacy of Free Speech in America. This is a case that really is a paradigmatic example of the United States' commitment to what the Supreme Court has called the bedrock principle of free speech, viewpoint neutrality. Government must remain neutral with respect to the viewpoint of the speech, no matter how hated or hateful it is. We have to respond with counter speech, with debate, with rebuttal, with ignoring it, whatever strategy is most effective. But it is not for government to take the decision of how to respond away from us. So this principle was put to the test in the most memorable way in the late 1970s when the ACLU, which has always opposed hatred and discrimination of every sort, came to the defense of a group of neo-Nazis who wanted to peacefully protest in Skokie, Illinois, a city near Chicago that had not only a large Jewish population, but at the time, many of them were Holocaust survivors. And it was an easy case in the courts of law because the viewpoint neutrality principle was at stake. The ACLU won in every single court, including the US Supreme Court, which went to the unusual step of not even receiving briefs or hearing oral arguments. That's how easy the case was legally. But in the court of public opinion, it was extremely controversial, even among ACLU members who feel strongly enough about free speech that they fork over their, here's another advertisement, $20, it's still only $20 to be a card-carrying member, said this goes too far for us. And so the ACLU lost 15% of our members. Now, very quickly thereafter, we gained back. A lot of people have said, well, you really do put your principle above where your money is. You've lost a lot of money, you've paid the price, so we restored our membership. But right after that, R.A. Nair, who was the ACLU's executive director, wrote this amazing book. And let me tell you, R.A. Nair was himself, is himself. He's still 87 years old. He lives not too far from here. He was himself a Holocaust survivor, born in Berlin while Hitler was in power. His extended family was completely exterminated, but he and his immediate family escaped to the United States. And he wrote this wonderful book in which he said, and it's eloquent, I recommend it. After you buy Ilya's book, if you still have money left, please buy this one. One of the points he made was, I loathe the Nazis. I absolutely loathe the Nazis. Even more than I love free speech, I loathe the Nazis. So if I believed that censoring the Nazis would have stopped them from rising to power, would have prevented the Holocaust, I would have been in favor of censoring them. And he then goes through the history of the Weimar Republic, which shows that there was censorship of hate speech and anti-Semitic speech, and it simply, obviously did not work. It gave the Nazis a propaganda platform. It gave them attention and sympathy that they otherwise would not have. So my bottom line for all of us now is, please let us not abandon our commitment to free speech in our zeal to fight anti-Semitism. To my conservative friends in the Federalist Society, I know the Federalist Society always defines itself as a group of conservatives and libertarians. I've always been more identified with the libertarian wing. But I think of free speech as being a conservative value in the most profound sense. And I really urge you not to abandon free speech now, as I see too many conservatives wanting to get revenge on the progressives who have been in the forefront of censorship. My friend Greg Conti is here from Princeton University. He wrote a wonderful piece in Compact a couple of days ago in which he talks about the pragmatic as well as the principled reason why conservatives should support free speech, similar to the pragmatic as well as principled arguments I've been making to my liberal counterparts. And I think for those of us who support free speech neutrally and across the board, it's incumbent on us to call out our ideological allies when they are the ones that are abandoning free speech. So I hope the conservatives as well as the libertarians in the Federalist Society will do that.
Ilya, why don't we, since the whole plan for this event as originally constituted was for you to talk to us about a little bit about the findings that you make in your book. Why don't you go ahead and give us some of those highlights?
Well, sure.
Or lowlights.
Yeah.
What would you say?
Yeah. Well, first, Nadine, I was thinking as you were talking, you know, I wish the ACLU was still the ACLU of the Skokie days, or your days when you were the leader. It seems like too often it, like other institutions, has become, you know, weighing speech and other liberties against values like equity and other things. And
I disagree, but I'm not going to.
Okay. Well, anyway. They're still good on campaign finance. They're consistent on that. Look, so I had my lived experience, as it were, at Georgetown, where I had a controversial tweet, and I was suspended before I was even technically on faculty, and investigated for whether I was violating harassment and anti-discrimination policies. It was, as I described it, 4 days of hell, where I wasn't sure whether I was going to lose my entire career, my entire life. And then followed by 4 months of purgatory that increasingly became farce. And then I was reinstated on the technicality that I wasn't employed when I tweeted. But I got this report from the DEI office saying that next time I offended somebody, I'd be back in the Inquisition. I'd be creating a hostile educational environment. And so realizing that I couldn't do the job I was hired to do, either internally teaching student programs, externally advocacy, media, writing, I quit. And as one does, I published my resignation letter in the Wall Street Journal and announced my move to the Manhattan Institute on Fox News, and have been using this platform I've been given to shine a light on the rot in academia. And this I trace to 3 big failures that I alluded to earlier. Ideology. You know, we thought when I was in law school, which sometimes feels like just yesterday and sometimes feels like a planet far away a long time ago, we thought that critical theory, critical legal studies, all that was something from the 80s and 90s that had been relegated to some dark corner of the sociology department. But now it's back, and this idea that your rights and freedoms depend on whether you're part of a class deemed oppressor or oppressed, that the law is illegitimate, institutions need to be rebuilt according to rebalanced power dynamics and intersectional matrices and all this, problems of ideology, faculty hiring bias and all of that. Then bureaucracy, which has become the tail that wags the dog, and even deans of prestigious law schools cower at their DEI colleagues, and who run orientation sessions and essentially set the campus culture fundamentally against the core mission of universities to seek truth and create knowledge, because some of those truths, some of that knowledge might be politically incorrect or represent, again, these privilege imbalances, what have you. And in the last decade, most of that bureaucratic growth has been in DEI. And to be clear, the DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, as dictionary definitions are perfectly fine, healthy even. Prevents groupthink, makes people feel welcome. You know, equity, centuries-old Anglo-American concept that just means fairness. But as practiced, it means the opposite of those things. In Orwellian, literally Orwellian fashion, it opposes intellectual diversity. It prevents equality of opportunity, and it excludes those who diverge from a rigid orthodoxy. And then there's leadership. Most deans and presidents and provosts and department chairs are not woke radicals or social justice warriors. They're spineless cowards. They have succeeded in climbing the greasy pole of academic bureaucracy by responding aptly to the incentives posed before them. And they decided correctly until very recently that placating the squeaky wheel of the illiberal left is the way to go. Now most students are not part of the illiberal left, or they're not right-wing activists either. They're just there to get a degree, get a job, maybe have a good time while they're doing it. They try to keep their head down during this cancellation crossfire. But it chills everyone. You see the FIRE surveys about students not feeling comfortable expressing their views in class. Heck, 34% of students say it's okay to use violence to silence someone they disagree with. This is a failure of leadership, because almost every school in the country, thanks in part to FIRE's good efforts, Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, has pretty decent policies on paper or pixels. Not all. There's plenty of things that I've written about and others about, say, Penn or Northwestern student handbook. Anyway, you can go examples about the actual policies. But the enforcement is the real problem. The unevenness or just the failure to enforce. And that's why we've seen in the post-10/7 world, where you have these illegal encampments, disruptions of educational programming, other Title VI violations, and you see a live experiment of different kinds of leaders. That would happen at Columbia, just up the road. We can all get together and bash in Columbia right here, versus, say, University of Florida under Ben Sass, who not only kicked out these encampments, but turned the sprinklers on them, which is a very creative idea for dealing with this. Or the Vanderbilt chancellor, Dan Diermeyer, who kicked out and had arrested and expelled the students that had taken over his office and beat up security guards. Very low bar. You just enforce your own rules that are logical and commonsensical, and that gets you national acclaim. But that's the state of where we are. Now, in the 3 years since I left Georgetown, there have been green shoots. There have been positive signs. I won't say optimistic, but I'm less pessimistic than I was. But it'll take an all-of-the-above strategy involving state legislatures for public schools, congressional oversight. We've seen the success of the naming and shaming of all those panels of presidents in Congress. Federal executive branch actions, which we can debate. I think some of the tactics might have been better strategized, but after these investigations, I think they're finally on track, as well as private employers, declining to hire people who support Hamas or who shout at federal judges that they hope their daughters get raped, as happened to Kyle Duncan at Stanford a couple of years ago. So we're still very much in the eye of the storm, and some institutions will fail or will continue to fail, but the battle has been joined.
If I have to put in a word here for the counterpoint problem, so I completely agree with Ilya, and I think after October 7th it became very clear to me that if we are to have meaningful free speech, that means that we need to have punishment and restriction of actual violence as well as unprotected speech, such as targeted harassment or bullying, not only to protect personal safety, but to protect the people who want to speak but are deterred because of violence or speech that should not be constitutionally protected. But we have many, many, many other examples of universities, including NYU and Columbia, that have also erred in the other direction of punishing expression that is constitutionally protected because of disagreement with the viewpoint. It could be because of pressure. We're seeing a lot of this from politicians, government officials, not only at the federal level of government, but also state and local. I'm glad that Ilya referred to the studies that have been done by FIRE, of which I'm very proud to be a senior fellow. FIRE's most recent reports show that in contrary to what had happened until 2023, when most of the sensorial experiences on campus were coming from the left and were coming from students and faculty and administrators, since October 7th, most of the pressures are coming from the right, are mostly targeting pro-Palestinian advocacy, and are coming from government officials. So again, it's my appeal to be neutral, please. Let's please complain when there's not sufficient support for safety or sufficient punishment.
Actual safety, to be clear, because that word's been,
well, yes, we mean actual safety. physical safety, because unfortunately there are reports of physical assaults that seemingly were unpunished, but there has been too much suppression of speech, and sometimes it still happens to pro-Zionist speech as well. You know, anybody associated with Israel is still subject to pressures on many campuses around the country. So let's keep our eyes on the whole spectrum of problems, regardless of what our own political views are.
Thank you, Ilya, for describing your book. And now, Judge Altman, you have written a book which you are scheduled to publish, I believe, in April of next year, that is titled Israel on Trial. Can you share with us what it's about and what inspired you to write it?
Sure. So I have spent the last 2 years, I'll just tell you that before October the 7th, I'm an immigrant to this country. I came from Venezuela. I was just talking to somebody about that. We came here with very little, just like many of your families probably. And we learned very quickly that in America you could be and do anything so long as you worked hard and treated people with respect. And I really, when I became a federal judge, I think one of the great pleasures and privileges of the job is that I get to naturalize our newest citizens every few months, just as I was naturalized just a couple decades ago.
Me too.
And that one was a mistake, but usually we get them right. And I like to say it's the only hearing I have in federal court where everybody goes home happy, you know. And I tell them every few months that this citizenship, it certainly is a privilege, and I remember it very fondly that day, me and my family waving those little American flags. But it comes with obligation, because we're not an absolute monarchy. We're not a theocracy. Every citizen plays a vital role in the defense of our democracy. And so I tell them, your role, of course, you have these obligations that are big: serve in the Army if you're conscripted, serve on juries, pay your taxes. But then you've got the little things, the day-to-day things that we're kind of talking about here: supporting your neighbor, being a productive citizen, tolerating the other. And you know, when I was a federal judge and I was privileged to be a judge, I really thought, you know, if one day I pass away, I was asked about this on a podcast recently, what do you want it to say on your tombstone? And I was like, well, that's pretty dark. I eat a lot of kale. But I said, look, I guess the answer would have been different before October 7th. I would have wanted it to say that I was a good husband and father, and that I was a fair judge and a model citizen. But after October 7th, everything's different. It's like we were all asleep, and this moral rot was festering inside of the wooden framework of our house. And if we're not careful, it will all come tumbling down on all of us, not just on the Jews. You know, you go back through history and you see that societies that persecute the Jews are societies that are sick and dying. So not just because I'm Jewish, but because first and foremost I am an American who loves this country and who appreciates all the wonderful blessings that it has given me. I've taken it upon myself to go around the country over the last 2 years, just about every week, to college campuses and churches and synagogues and schoolyards in almost all the 50 states, to meet with people and to talk to them about what's really going on in the world. And what I've discovered is that there are 6 abiding, persistent claims about the state of Israel, all of which are totally and completely false, but which millions, tens of millions of Americans believe with such fervency that they refuse even to accept the opposite proposition in an open discourse. It's not just that people believe what is not true. It's that they believe it so passionately that they refuse even to accept the possibility that someone might have a different view. And so I decided to write a book called Israel on Trial that takes those 6 claims, all of which are legal claims, by the way. We hear them talked about and contorted on campus in ways that make them seem political or social or racial. They're none of those things. The claims are all legal. Is Israel violating the laws of war and committing a genocide? A preposterous claim under any definition of the law of genocide. Is Israel an apartheid state? We talked about this already. A ridiculous claim in light of any definition, either legal or historical, of what apartheid means. Apartheid is an Afrikaans word. It means separateness. It comes from South African apartheid. Israel meets none of the elements of South African apartheid or Jim Crow apartheid or antebellum South apartheid. Zero. It means none of the elements. And then there are other ones. You know, is it an occupation? Is it colonialism? These are absurd claims. The Jewish people are the indigenous people of the land. We have lived in that land according to black and white carved in stone artifacts that have been excavated thousands of years before there even was such a thing as Zionism by Egyptian and German and British archaeologists who had no stake in the action. We have been living in this land and governing this land for thousands of years, long before there was ever such a thing as Islam, long before Muhammad was born, long before Arabs who are Arabian, from Arabia, ever came to Israel in 636 AD at the Battle of Yarmouk. Thousands of years before that, Jews were living and governing in the land of Israel. The claim that they're colonists is absurd. So what the book does is it takes the 6 legal claims about the state of Israel, and it says, let's apply a judicial methodology to these claims, a legal methodology. It says, what is the claim? That's what we do in our legal briefs. It says, what is the relevant legal rule? And then it says, what are the facts on the ground? And then it issues a verdict as to each of the 6 claims.
Lisa, are you writing a book?
I am not writing a book, and so you don't need to go on Amazon. But I did have a speech at Harvard after October 7th. In fact, it specifically addressed campus speech after October 7th, as we are addressing today. And I wanted to just give you a little bit of a preview of that speech, a little bit of the why and a little bit of the what I said, because that seemed to also take, a debate seemed to take place over Twitter as to what I had said. And the why. After October 7th, I expected that October 8th would be the same thing as September 12th, after September 11th. And September 12th, for those of you who are too young to have witnessed this, it was a moment of unity for our country. So I thought that too would follow. Instead, on October 8th, our divisions broke wide open. I was fortunate enough to be present at a speech that Bari Weiss delivered at Federalist Society National Convention, where she described October 8th as a moral and spiritual catastrophe that was on full display through the West before the bodies of those men and women and children had even been identified. People poured into the streets of our capital cities to celebrate the slaughter, but most alarming of all were the young people who threw their support not behind the innocent victims of Hamas terrorists, but behind Hamas. And we witnessed on campus how the young people behaved. They erected the encampments where Jews were forbidden to pass. They stormed campus buildings while Jewish students had to, out of fear for their lives, barricade themselves in a library or a classroom. Jewish students were assaulted walking across campus simply because they were Jewish. And the protesters also, as Ilya has described, disrupted classes, either loudly or quietly, displaying certain symbols associated with the attacks of October 7th. And I was speaking at a Federalist Society event at a law school, and I was discussing some of the symbols that were being displayed by the protesters. And I was surprised by the fact that the students don't understand what the symbols mean. And so I decided I was going to give a talk about what they are, what they do mean. Because if you choose to display these symbols, you need to understand what they mean. And you don't get to escape their meaning simply by saying, but I just ordered this off Amazon, it must be okay. Or all my friends are doing it, it must be okay. You need to understand what it is you are saying and what you are displaying. And you will find that the meaning is anything but benign. And let's start with the black and white Palestinian keffiyeh. This was popularized by Yasser Arafat, the former leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization, whose single purpose was the destruction of Israel. He is known as the father of modern terrorism, having orchestrated the kidnapping and murder of Israeli athletes during the 1972 Munich Summer Olympic Games. The bloody hands. In 2000, 2 Israel Defense Force reservists accidentally entered a PLO-controlled area and were taken into custody. A Palestinian mob then murdered and mutilated both soldiers before setting one on fire. One member of the mob showed his blood-soaked hand to the crowd, which erupted in cheers. And the From the River to the Sea chant, and this is actually the thing that I encountered on campus that students had no idea. Israel is bordered by the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Hamas's charter calls for the destruction of the Jewish state and the genocide of the Jews from the river to the sea. Hamas has told us what the chant means. And so I went on campus to talk about these things, to caution students so that you understand what it is you are actually saying. And then I also caution students, to the extent you bring your protests into classrooms, campuses have conduct policies, and just because they're not being enforced at the time doesn't mean they won't be enforced the next day. And I especially caution law students that if you are so sanctioned, this could be reportable to the state bar, and it could affect your ability to practice law. I in no way suggested that people aren't free to protest on campus. I have never suggested that. My speeches have always been about the disruption of speakers and classrooms. And that is my summary.
You know, these eloquent presentations by our esteemed panelists about information that unfortunately is not only not well known, but as you say, Roy, people just almost seem to have a mental block against it, and maybe are not even curious to know what it is that these symbols mean, Lisa, to me underscores the real tragedy of FIRE's most recent survey, which came out just on September 9th. And again, you know, another tragedy, it came out just the day before Charlie Kirk was assassinated, because as Ilya mentioned, one of the shocking discoveries, revelations, and this was by far the largest survey that's ever been done of campuses, done by College Pulse together with FIRE, 70,000 students on 257 campuses, that 34%, including as many conservatives as progressives, believed that violence is at least sometimes justified as a way to stop somebody from speaking. Another really disturbing aspect of this survey was how many students, and Ilya, I believe, alluded to this, say that they cannot have a candid and frank discussion about the most important issues on their campuses, not only in class, but also in informal settings, such as dormitories and cafeterias. The number one toxic subject was exactly what we're talking about. 53% said they can't discuss. They couldn't listen to what you said, Roy. They couldn't listen to what any of you said because they are just too afraid to even raise the subject. And that's, and then let me just give you a couple other examples. First, on Israel-Gaza, survey-wide, it was 53% who said they couldn't discuss it. On 21 campuses, 75% of students said they could not discuss that topic. And at Barnard, uptown, which came out the very last in terms of the worst free speech environment of all 257, 90% of students say they can't discuss the subject. I live around the corner from Barnard, and they are all wearing the keffiyeh and chanting from the river to the sea. They're happy to have these soundbite shouting exchanges, but not to engage in discussion. And there are other subjects that are also, to me, shockingly undiscussed. Number two, after Israel-Gaza, was abortion, another legal issue, as well as a moral and religious issue. 46% of students say they can't discuss this topic. The next presidential election, 42% say they can't talk about it. Now, lower down on the list, but still extremely shocking to me, and I think to all of us, free speech. It is such a controversial topic that 20% of the students said they could not candidly discuss it. And that's separate from, there was a separate category for hate speech. 27% said they couldn't discuss that. So we're just talking about plain, vanilla, ordinary free speech. And I say all of this to especially the students in the audience. This is a cultural matter. In addition to the lack of speech protective policies, in addition to the lack of enforcement of the policies by too many administrators, even on schools that do very well in terms of written policies and enforcement of policies, the experience of free speech is still lacking because of the lack of a free speech culture. And that's why I feel very strongly that the appropriate response to the left-wing cancel culture that we have been seeing is not the right-wing cancel culture that we are now seeing. And I would urge conservatives as well as libertarians in the Federalist Society and students in particular to please do what you can to restore a culture of free speech that is not unduly, yes, of course, strongly criticize views that you disagree with, but not in such a disproportionately harsh, punitive way that you are silencing debate on these vital issues.
So the lesson that I've learned is I need to write a book. But I would be remiss if I didn't note that you recently published a book about free speech entitled The War on Words, 10 Arguments Against Free Speech and Why They Fail. What can you briefly tell us about your book other than that it's on Amazon?
Well, you know, this book was actually inspired by one that is similar to Roy's. My former law professor and now longtime friend Alan Dershowitz wrote a book a year or two ago called 10 Lies About Israel and How to Answer Them. And I thought, wow, you know, there are a lot of, I wouldn't say lies, but ignorance about free speech. My friend and colleague Greg Lukianoff, who is president and CEO of FIRE, and I are constantly speaking about free speech, and we're constantly encountering the same arguments over and over and over again. We never get tired of answering them. We love that. But we thought we might as well put them in writing. And so, you know, paraphrasing Alan's book about Israel, the 10 most common arguments about free speech. And by the way, Lisa and everybody else, Greg and I had a list of about 25 really common arguments that we each encountered. And we separately went about the task of prioritizing which are the 10 most important, and then we ranked those. And then our editor independently did the same thing. And all three of us concluded that the number one most pervasive, most dangerous, most wrong-headed argument was words are violence. Right? You're all nodding, and FIRE has done surveys that show what a shockingly high percentage of students believe that. The Buckley Institute at Yale did a survey that showed that 81% of students believe that. And that, of course, fuels the tragic assassination of Charlie Kirk. Because if you think that words are violence, then it makes sense, right, to respond to words that you perceive as violent with actual violence. And thank you for reminding me, Ilya. I'm always going to have to use that adjective about actual safety and actual violence.
It's like when I talk about Congress's jurisdiction over actually interstate actual commerce.
Time for audience questions?
Yeah, I think we have time for a few questions, but first let's give it up for our panel. So I'm going to come around with the mic. If you have a question, raise your hand and I'll bring it over to you.
Hi, thank you all for doing this. Let's stipulate for a second, in particular with respect to the judges, in terms of the arguments you made about the double standards and the inconsistent history and some of the false history about the Israel-Palestine conflict and the way universities have dealt with it. Let's just say a group here at NYU comes and wants a room like this, and the topic is going to be, we're going to make a case for Israel as an apartheid state. It's a bad actor. What it's doing is genocide. I'll repeat, I don't have to repeat all the slogans, most of which you mentioned. It's going to be peaceful. It's going to be modeling civil decorum like we have here, but that's what we want to talk about. And by the way, a few people here will be wearing keffiyehs. By the way, he's a bad guy, people say, but he won the Nobel Peace Prize, they'll say. Jewish group comes to the dean and says, you know, we don't feel safe. Really bad language, and it hasn't been even-handed, and that's threatening. What is to be done?
Well, I don't think it's such a hypothetical. These
Happens
sorts
all day long,
happens all
every
the
day.
time. You know, I went to Princeton for undergrad, and we get all these announcements about the panels and events that they have at the what used to be called the Woodrow Wilson School. I would have hoped they'd rename it after, you know, George Shultz or Allen Dulles, any number of diplomats that Princeton's had. But no, I guess they're waiting for someone to donate $1 billion to rename it. But anyway, School of Public International Affairs, and they have all sorts of these, you know, Israel genocide conferences constantly. So you don't have to hypothesize. And the answer is, as long as it's actually not disruptive and it's, you know, safe, and they, you know, it's an actual student organization, actually safe. You know, a duly registered student organization, you know, checks all the boxes for reserving the room properly and all of that. Then go on ahead and have it. And the Jewish group just, you know, stay away from them, or go, or have a counter event, or, you know, any number of things, or hold up signs. I mean, whatever you think, whatever, you know, makes you feel, you know, better about the situation.
Hi. I was wondering if you could speak to where free speech intersects with very poor judgment. Perhaps this is picking up on what Judge Branch was speaking to, but where maybe the substance of what someone is saying is not so much the problem as the rashness and insensitivity with which it's delivered. I think in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, there were a lot of student groups who issued statements, because of course we all wait with bated breath to know what they have to say on the subject, but the speed and sort of lack of waiting to hear anything more as the awful details were continuing to come out seemed like it was quite distinct from the problem of what was actually said. And so whether it would ever be appropriate to, for example, for employers to take into account a lack of judgment versus sanctioning someone because of their political opinion.
Well, I just think employers can take into account whatever it is they want to take into account, and we saw that in the aftermath of October 7th. From a legal perspective, obviously, it doesn't really matter, right? I mean, if it's rash, if it's offensive, I think we all grew up with the mantra that sticks and stones may break my bones, but, well, you get it, right? Or maybe you don't, because I guess you think that words are violence. But I just don't see that as being a problem. But that's also not what really has been going on campus. You know, I've been to dozens of campuses over the last 2 years, and I get these students, Jewish students, who come up to me and they say, hey, Judge, how did you deal with anti-Semitism when you were at Columbia? And I'm like, well, you know, first of all, I was 6'4", 230 pounds, so there was not a lot of that, you know. But really, like a quarter of the student body was Jewish. When I was at Yale Law School, I think it was 20 or 25% also was Jewish. Those numbers are, I think, down in single digits now. I guess Jews are just getting much dumber over the last 10 years. It has nothing to do with admissions policies. But put that aside. What actually happened on these campuses is not that Harvard's student groups, whatever they were, issued a statement blaming Israel for October 7th. Okay, they made their judgment, they made their choice, and now let them live with it. The issue was that Jewish students were routinely going to their dorm rooms, and they were covered in swastikas. At Yale, at the Chabad house, where I used to go when I was a student, the students, dozens of them, walking into the Chabad house, had frozen water bottles, essentially ice blocks, chucked at them by a mob of hundreds of students. There's videos of this all over the internet. We have videos also at Yale and at Harvard and at Columbia of dozens of students linking arm in arm, preventing visibly Jewish students from entering a classroom. I mean, this is like what happened in the 1930s in Vienna. So Again, I have no problem, to your question, that's every single day at almost every college in America is an apartheid divest event, a genocidal demonization of Israel event. Have your events. But this is not speech. This is not appropriate. This is the violation of the rights of your students, and universities have an obligation to enforce their rules as to the Jewish students, the same as they would as to everybody else. To me, that's very simple.
And the beauty of this country, quite honestly, and this radical idea that we have of free speech is that you are also free to have poor judgment. And you can very quickly react to a situation without knowing all of the facts. You're free to do that. Nobody is in any way trying to stop you from doing that. You just can't interfere with the physical safety of other students, and you cannot shut down speakers on campus, and you cannot disrupt classes. And those are all within school conduct policies, and all of these schools that have permitted this to occur have these conduct policies. They just aren't enforcing them.
And by the way, I should just add, we're judges and lawyers, right? By definition, our job entails coming into a courtroom and having half of the people in the room on a daily basis utter things that end up being wrong, right? They're either wrong on the law, wrong on the facts, sometimes both, right? That's what the law is. We don't censor one side just because it's got the facts or the law right. We let them make their case. That, as I said before, that's a hallmark of Western civilization, and we seem to have forgotten that. In the place where it matters the most, in law schools and college campuses where free speech and open discourse should be the most vibrant. One of the things I loved the most about being at Columbia when I was a kid is that I was 18 and they had the core, which meant that we were all reading the same amazing books at the same time. And you came from totally different places, different walks of life, different socioeconomic backgrounds, different political perspectives. And you had totally different views of Kant and Plato and Aristotle. And you would go, and I mean, it's very nerdy to say, I suppose, but you would go to the bars and like you could think of nothing else. So you would just start debating these things at bars around Columbia. That's what college is supposed to be about, plus the beer. Now, as I understand it, college students don't drink too much beer and they don't have much debate. So what are their parents paying for?
You know, I want to say that I, of course, totally defend the right of peaceful protest. All of us do. But as an educator, I am very dismayed that so much of the discourse, if you can use that word, about this very important topic of Israel-Gaza is reduced to warring groups of students shouting slogans at each other rather than a more rational, educated discourse that one would hope for on campus. But as I was thinking about that, I recalled a study that was published this summer by John Shields and a couple of his colleagues at Claremont McKenna College, in which they studied, there's an amazing database that's available now of literally 7 million, or it may even be 70 million, an astronomical number of syllabi from courses all over the United States and some other countries as well. And they honed in on what was actually being taught on a couple controversial topics, one of which was Israel-Gaza. And I guess we shouldn't be shocked, but sadly there was a complete absence of not only viewpoint diversity, but information diversity. And the criteria that they used had nothing to do with politics, but just the academic credibility and bona fides. So even people who were, you know, critical of Israel and not pro-Zionist, but had serious academic critiques of Edward Said and the others who were routinely taught, were not being taught. And I think, you know, John made the friendly point that in addition to FIRE looking at how students feel, their comfort level, we really should do more to encourage what is being taught and make sure that students are exposed in the classroom to a full range of academically credible and important viewpoints.
And that's why, in addition to the Chicago Principles on Free Speech, which are very famous, and now the almost as famous Calvin report on institutional neutrality and why that's important, like Taylor Swift, NYU shouldn't be expected to take a position on every little political controversy that comes down the pike. But also the Shills report, which is not having ideological or viewpoint discrimination in faculty hiring. Very important. And hard to reform at this point because, again, of implicit bias. Not people that look like you, but people that think like you, and we've been going in that direction. But one other aspect of your question, which I think you might have been most getting at, which is cancel culture. Because if I can rephrase your question, I think this is a concern that probably a lot of you have is, conservatives criticized in the last 5-10 years cancel culture. And now, all of a sudden, we're saying you shouldn't hire people who, have this view or that view. The thing about cancel culture, it's never been, at least the way I've understood it or the way that I've criticized it, it's never been that you should never face any negative consequences for anything you say. Greg Lukianoff, Nadine's co-author, my friend, longtime head of FIRE, I think had a very good definition. You could look it up, but it's like mob-like behavior to have disproportionate negative, typically employment-related consequences or actions for views that are inside the Overton window, meaning within the mainstream broadly defined. So it has to have all of those different kinds of elements. So it's different when Whoopi Goldberg is suspended for her ignorance. That's different than some shopkeeper who donated $100 10 years ago to some cause that is now deemed politically incorrect and then gets boycotted. Same thing with, we see that dynamic. And so I think it's appropriate for law firms looking at graduates from elite law schools, if you're signing a statement supporting literal baby killers, that kind of bad judgment is, something to consider. But it's not, you're pro-life, I won't hire you, you're pro-choice, I won't hire you, something like that. Unless, of course, you're explicitly, like if you're Planned Parenthood, that's fine. I think it's okay if you don't hire pro-lifers, things like that, if you're an explicitly ideological organization. But universities don't claim to be. If you had Marxist U, or if you had, for that matter, Opus Dei U. I mean, you can have restrictions against, blasphemy laws and all these different things. If you're expelled from Marxist U if you carry around a Milton Friedman book or something like that. Perfectly fine. If you advertise up front, that's what you are. But what we run into is when things are taken out of proportion, there's mobs, and people people who are not political soldiers get caught in this crossfire.
Well, one last round of applause for our panelists and everybody. Thank you all for being here today. We really appreciate it, being sensitive of time. I know the facilities folks got to start taking stuff down now, but Ilya will be outside. We have some copies of his book for attendees, so he said he's willing to stick around for a little and sign some of those. And finally, I'd just like to reiterate huge thanks to Jonathan Farber, the gentleman who had offered an off-campus venue for this event before we had been able to move back to NYU. That's just an incredibly gracious offer, and we really appreciate it. Thank you to our panelists, and this was great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.